Hello, and thank you for watching this video about niches and competition. Each organism in an ecosystem has adaptations, which are characteristics or traits that help it to survive and reproduce. These adaptations mean that each organism has a very specific role. The role or position of an organism in its habitat is called its niche or niche. You could also say that an organism's niche is how an organism makes a living. A niche also includes what type of food the organism eats, how it obtains this food, and what other organisms eat it. A niche also includes when and how the organism reproduces and the physical conditions it requires to survive. For example, the niche of a honeybee is the time of day it is active, the type of flowers it gets nectar from, the temperature range it can survive in, where it builds its hive, which other species it interacts with, and how it interacts with those other species. In any ecosystem, there are many organisms that share the same habitat, but because they each usually have their own niches, they are able to live together. They may live in their own special places, have their own sources of food, and have different things that they need to survive. But what if organisms do try to have the same niche? What if they need the same resources? Well, things get a little complicated. Have you ever heard of the word competition? Maybe you know what it is, or you've been a part of one before. Maybe you know what it means to compete. A competition in our daily lives means that we are trying to compete against other people in order to win something, like a prize or a trophy or a contest. The word competition is a noun that means an event or contest in which people compete. Maybe you play a sport like soccer or basketball or football or track running. Each game or tournament that you play in is a competition. You are trying to win the game. Or maybe you have another talent that involves art or music, and you try to enter a competition for that, and you are trying to win and beat everyone else. The word competition could also be the actual person or people that you are competing against, or your opponents. Someone might say, "We have to crush the competition." By saying that, they are talking about the actual people you are competing against. The word compete is a verb that means to try to win something by defeating others who are trying to do the same. It can also mean to take part in a contest or competition. You are competing in the contest or game. There are a few things that need to be true in order to say that you are competing against someone. Let's say your chosen competition is a game of football. In order to be competing against someone in football, you have to be in the same place. Can you be competing against someone while you are in Michigan and they are in Mexico? No, you have to be right there on the same field. In order to compete against someone, you also have to be competing at the same time. If you play in a football game on a Friday night and another team plays on a Tuesday night, are you competing against them? No, you are competing against the team that was actually playing at the same time as you on your field on Friday night. So competing or competitions happen at the same time. Lastly, in order for it to be a competition, you have to be competing for the same thing. You are playing a football game. So can you be competing against someone who is in a singing competition? No, you're both doing totally different things and competing for totally different things. Since you are not competing for the same thing, you aren't competing against one another. The reason why we are learning about competition is because organisms compete too. All living things need many things in order to stay alive, such as food, water, and space. If organisms are trying to use the same resources in the same place at the same time, they are competing with one another. Competition between organisms means that they are competing for the same resource, like food, water, shelter, or space, in the same place at the same time. Competition can be defined as the conflict that arises when two different species try to use a limited amount of resources. Let's look at an example. Here's an image of some dark-colored mussels and some light-colored barnacles living on a rock near the seashore. These two species are competing for space, which there's little of in this intertidal zone. They are competing for the same resource, space on the rocks, in the same place at the same time. They are competing. But can the mussels and barnacles continue living together like this on the rocks? What might eventually happen to these two species competing for space? Thinking about competitions that we are in sometimes, there are typically winners and losers, right? So if these mussels and barnacles continue to compete, eventually one of them might win and the other might lose. One of the two species will likely outcompete and eliminate the other. The reason for this is because each niche can only be occupied by one species at a time. Two organisms cannot have the exact same position or role in an ecosystem. Eventually, one of them might be kicked out of that role and might not live there anymore. One is typically going to be better than the other one at competing. Different species can share the same habitat and food requirements, but not be in competition. Remember, in order for it to be competition, they have to be competing in the same place for the same thing at the same time. For example, the flycatcher and the elf owl both live on the saguaro cactus, and they both eat insects. This means that they live in the same place and need the same food. However, these two species do not occupy exactly the same niche because they do not hunt at the same time. The flycatcher is active during the day, while the owl is active mostly at night. This means that they don't compete at the same time, since they eat at different times of day. Lucky for the flycatcher and the elf owl, they are not true competitors. They can live in harmony. But what if the flycatcher and the elf owl did hunt at the same time? Well, this would mean that they would start competing for food at the same time. Competition usually leads to winners and losers. One of them would likely catch more insects and have more food, and the other species might not survive. This is because only one species can occupy each niche. Here is another example of organisms who live in the same habitat and need the same resources, but have adaptations that enable them to reduce competition. For example, there are 3 species of warblers that all feed off of insects that live in the spruce tree. At first, it appears that they have satisfied all 3 requirements for competition: same resource, same place, and same time. But wait, these warblers actually feed off of different parts of the tree. They are not actually in the same place. The Cape May warbler feeds at the tips of the branches near the top of the tree. The bay-breasted warbler feeds in the middle part of the tree, and the yellow-rumped warbler feeds in the lower part of the tree and at the base of the middle branches. By feeding on insects in different areas of the tree, the birds avoid competing for food and are able to live together peacefully. But what if the birds did feed in the same location of the tree? Well, that would mean that they would start competing for food. There would be a winner and a couple losers. One warbler species would get more food, and the other species might not survive. Remember, only one species can occupy each niche.